So my own radar start picking up items going 3,000–4,000 miles an hour in this area.
But I do remember speeds in excess of 4,000 to 5,000 miles an hour.
And he said it was traveling 10,000 miles plus.
And they were going somewhere in the neighborhood of 11 to 14,000 miles an hour.
They covered the distance from Columbus to Detroit in something like equivalent of about 20,000 miles an hour.
It's not an infrequent occurrence out there. They have them quite often.
There were probably 1,500 reported cases at that time.
I have over 3,000 cases now.
They estimated 100 yards from the left wing was this 100-foot disc.
And the strength of the signal was as strong as the surface contact on the water of an aircraft carrier. This contact was huge.
The size of these objects around 100 meters or greater.
So it would go from 1 o'clock, 7 or 8 miles to 6, 7 o'clock, 7 or 8 miles inside of 4 or 5 seconds. You have to be moving pretty quickly.
They could rise, just go straight up. They could do that, just seemed like instantaneous.
Once they started moving, they went straight up, for a while, and then they went zap.
Then it just sort of disappeared. It dematerialized.
And left the atmosphere, just was gone. It just took off into space.
It just left at high speed.
He said, "You are never to speak of this again. As far as you're concerned, this never happened."
And you never saw this, and I don't exist, and this situation never happened.
I didn't want to look at it any longer than that because I felt that my life was in jeopardy.
So I was beaten, literally hitting in the ribs and pushed, and I was resisting. And I know Sergeant Bustinza was doing the same thing.
Measures have been taken by agencies to terminate people who appear to be inconvenient or troublesome through knowing too much.
Whatever activity is going on, to the extent that it is a clandestine group, a quasi-government group, a quasi-private group, it is without any type, as far as I can tell, of high-level government oversight. And that is a great concern.
A shadowy government with its own Air Force, its own Navy, its own fundraising mechanism, and the ability to pursue its own ideas of the national interest, free from all checks and balances, and free from the law itself.
We have contact with aliens not originating from some foreign country, but from some other solar system. And I have been a party to that.
My name is Dr. Stephen Greer. I am the director of the Disclosure Project, which is a project of the Center for the Study of Extraterrestrial Intelligence. This is a project which we have been working on since 1992. And during this time, we have identified over 400 military, intelligence, and corporate witnesses to special access projects within the United States and elsewhere that deal with what the public has called UFOs, extraterrestrial intelligence, and advanced energy and propulsion systems. The purpose of this executive briefing is to put together some of this witness testimony. I want to emphasize that out of the over 400 witnesses whom we have identified, that we have interviewed to date on camera approximately 100. Of those, 120 hours of videotape have been created of testimony from these witnesses. This executive summary can only contain a very small tip of the iceberg, less than 1/2% of the possible testimony which we have. But it will give you an idea of the extent of the knowledge of these men and women who have come forward heroically to tell the world, to tell our elected representatives and our scientists the truth about a subject which has been the subject of much ridicule, fantasy, and speculation for over 50 years. We will present 3 essential areas. Number 1, what is the evidence? What is the testimony support? What is the case file support and what do the government documents support. We will also then move on to something a little more difficult to explain, and that is the mechanism for secrecy. How has something of this import been kept secret from our representatives, and how has it been kept off the national and international radar screen effectively for over 50 years? Without understanding this, the evidence itself has no foundation, because any rational person will conclude that this couldn't be true or we would know about it, that the government leaks secrets like a sieve, and that indeed, if any of this were true, many of the people in society, in high places in our government, would know about it, when in fact they do not. So the secrecy around this issue, which has been extraordinary, must also be explained, and it will be. And the third component is the why. Why has it been kept secret? What are the implications? I will remind you that a very conservative Republican two-term president and five-star general, Dwight Eisenhower, said that we should be careful of the excesses of the military-industrial complex. We now have learned, and you will hear testimony to this effect, that one of his chief concerns were that special access projects within the military and intelligence sector dealing with this subject were escaping the legal constitutional oversight of the American Congress and indeed of the American presidency. He stated this in January of 1961.
In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex. The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist. We must never let the weight of this combination endanger our liberties or democratic processes. We should take nothing for granted. Only an alert and knowledgeable citizenry can compel the proper meshing of the huge industrial and military machinery of defense with our peaceful methods and goals.
Eisenhower's warning has really come full circle to this date, where we now see extraordinary funds being put into projects and being withheld from the American public, which if released could give us indeed an entirely new and sustainable civilization. These propulsion and energy systems used for peaceful purposes would enable the world to get off of its dependency of fossil fuels, oil, and the internal combustion engine, and have a truly non-polluting, sustainable civilization for thousands of years. The implications of this statement cannot be overstated. We are really talking about the ability of our civilization to move within a generation from a world which is facing environmental collapse, oil shortages, rolling blackouts in some of our states, and eventually growing world tension over a shrinking oil supply while demand skyrockets over the next 10 to 20 years. That grim scenario can easily be replaced by the declassification and peaceful application of these technologies. In addition to this, we have to consider what the risks are if we do nothing. The technologies which are in compartmented secret programs that have been derived from studying extraterrestrial technologies as well as human innovations, which deal directly with energy generation and propulsion systems, are technologies which would enable the entire planet to begin to work in an integrated function and in a way that does not lead to greater and greater spiraling gaps between the rich and the poor. Beyond this, there is something of even greater concern. One of the witnesses whom you will hear from is a person who worked directly with Wernher von Braun, the very famous rocket scientist and space explorer, who warned on his deathbed that there were people planning to put weapons in space or to have space-effective weapon systems, which would be used in a hoax scenario from a threat, a hoax threat, that would be of extraterrestrial origin. There is no evidence that we are under any threat from any civilization from outside our solar system or within our solar system. However, there is a lot of evidence from this testimony that there are people who are deliberately trying to weaponize space under the guise of many situations which are really hoaxed scenarios. This is dangerous because if we are not alone in the universe, we cannot view space as our own private domain for Homo sapiens. We must view space as a frontier which must be shared peacefully with diverse life forms from throughout the universe. One of the points I would like to make also about these cases is that we must accept the testimony of all of these witnesses. The reason we must is that if we begin to dismiss dozens of military intelligence officers, corporate officials, as well as people within other walks of life who have professional credentials, their testimony on this issue, then it brings into question how we view witness testimony on many other things. If we use that same standard, every murder conviction in the United States should be overturned, which has been based on witness testimony. We would also, as Monsignor Balducci at the Vatican has pointed out to us, throw out the entire Bible, since that is almost totally based on human witness testimony of the people who wrote down the accounts during the times of Christ and his predecessors.
Storico è vissuto un uomo che si chiamava Gesù.
Can show that at a certain historical point lived a man named Jesus.
E questa dimostrazione si basa sulle testimonianze degli storici.
And in the end, this is based on human witness testimony.
Perché come facciamo a sapere che quel Vangelo è di quello lì, quell'altro è di quello là?
And how do we know that this gospel is from that man and this gospel is from this man is true?
E sono le testimonianze che
And
abbiamo
they are the testimony and the witnesses
Sì.
of those people.
Per cui, se si indebolisse il valore della testimonianza
If you
umana,
start taking apart and destroying the value of human witness testimony,
le conseguenze sono anche gravi, gravissime, tragiche per la religione, specie per la religione cristiana.
the consequences are grave, tremendous, especially for Christian religion.
I should emphasize that this human testimony is key, and in a sense is more important than any physical evidence because it is multiple, it is corroborating, and it can not be tossed out in a cavalier fashion. We should be very careful that we do not ignore this testimony because the testimony of these men and women serves as a significant body of evidence with the corroboration of photographs and other government documents. To introduce this part of the videotape, which deals specifically with pilots, radar cases, cases that involved telemetry and related technologies, I wish to emphasize that for decades, people who have been skeptical of this subject have claimed that if these objects were real, they would have been tracked on radar. We have no fewer than 20 witnesses from the Air Force, the Marines, the Navy, the Army, as well as civilian authorities in the United States and abroad who are qualified air traffic controllers and pilots who have seen these objects on radar. Please note that these people absolutely will state that these have not been weather balloons, they have not been air inversions, they have not been swamp gas. They have been structured craft traveling at thousands of miles per hour, then suddenly stopping, hovering, or moving in a nonlinear fashion where these objects have been tracked and going from one spot to 500 miles away or further within one radar sweep. Commander Graham Bethune piloted his plane across the North Atlantic in 1951. The testimony you will hear is important and significant for a number of reasons. The object was very close. It was in 1951 and was tracked on radar moving at 1,800 miles per hour, a speed which no craft in the world could move at that time in those speeds. Additionally, we've been able to locate his co-pilot as well as documents from the government of his official debriefing and report, which was made by the Navy and the military at that time.
The flight was normally about 10 hours, but that night we had a 60-knot wind, and it was a headwind. And about maybe 300 to 400 miles outside of Keflavik, out of Argentia, I'm sorry, I saw something below the horizon on the water that looked like approaching a city at night. It was just kind of an ambient light, no definition whatsoever, but the same thing that you would see if you were approaching a large city at night. And all of a sudden we saw on the water a yellow halo that was very, very small, about 15 miles away. And it came up to 10,000 feet like that, a fraction of a second. And I thought it was going to go right through us. And I disengaged the autopilot, pushed the nose over because I was going to go under it at the angle it was coming toward me. So what happened, the minute that I did that, it was up at our altitude, and I could see nothing outside of the cockpit but this craft. And so I didn't know which way to go. And then all of a sudden I heard a racket. I didn't know what it was. And I said, "Fred, what the hell was that?" He looked around and he says, "Oh," he said, "everyone was ducking in the back of us, and they collided, and they're all laying on the deck back there scrambling on the deck." So when I looked back, it wasn't there. And he says, "It's over here on the right-hand side." Now, it was about a mile or so away on the right-hand side, and it kind of drifted forward maybe to a position maybe 5 miles away, and that's where it stayed with us for quite some time. This is when we could first see, it wasn't above our altitude, it was below our altitude, but it's still above the horizon where you could see the side of the craft, you could see the dome, and you could see the color around the perimeter of the craft. And then we knew that it was a friendly encounter. I said, "Doc, did you see what we saw?" And he says, "Yeah." He says, he looked me straight in the eye. He says, "Yeah." He says, "It was a flying saucer." So I went back forward and I said, "Dal, whatever you do, don't tell anybody we saw anything. He'll lock us up as soon as we get on the ground." He said, "It's too late." He said, "I just called Gander Control to see if they could track this by radar." So that's how it got out. So when we landed at Argentia, the Air Force was there, and they interrogated us. And the captain that did the interrogation did a real good job, but you could tell that this wasn't his first time that he'd ever interrogated anybody as far as these craft were concerned. When that question was asked, it was 300 feet that came into my mind. And when I got the report out of the archives in 1991, I'd never seen anybody else's report. Everyone had been anywhere from 250 to 350 feet in diameter. Now, the velocity when it left us was estimated from between 1,000 miles an hour to 2,000 miles an hour. And when I looked at the report, Al Jones estimated 1,800 miles an hour. Mine was 1,000, another one was 1,500 miles an hour, in that range. It turns out that the radar report, which I've never seen, said it was 1,800 miles an hour. So the other plane commander was sitting in the seat, took my seat, he hit it right on the nose. Now my boss, that's another thing. When he found the report in the archives in Wright-Patterson on Project Blue Book, and talking to Colonel Watson, when he came back to me, he gave me the speed of 1,800 miles. I said, "Where did you find that out?" And he said, "Well, it was a radar report that said that." The document that I found was the official document that the Air Force had put together, different sources that came to them. And it was originally filed, it was under Project Grudge, you can see in their written Project Grudge, but on the front page it says Project Twinkle. Now this is where they put a lot of ones that they had to get rid of somehow. It was Project Twinkle. So it was in Project Blue Book and Project Grudge and what other project I don't know that was in.
Michael Smith was an air traffic controller with the Air Force, both in Oregon as well as subsequently in Michigan. At both of these facilities, he witnessed UFOs tracked on radar moving at extraordinary speeds, and he also confirms that NORAD, the North American Air Defense Command, was fully apprised of these events, and in fact, in one of these events in Michigan, was engaged and steered B-52s returning to a base around the UFOs, which were at low altitude and were intersecting the flight path of these B-52s. This man has a very good career, and he has documented his placement at these facilities at the time that these events occurred. It establishes the physical reality of these objects, and also, I should note, the fact that NORAD has been involved. This is of some significance since we have learned that President Clinton, ex-President Clinton, had asked Webster Hubbell, when he was third in command at Justice, to look into the UFO issue. And when Webster Hubbell and others made inquiries to NORAD, they denied any knowledge of these objects. This is serious because if these senior covert projects are lying to directed inquiries from the President of the United States, this constitutes a serious breach in our chain of command.
In spring of 1970, while I was stationed in Klamath Falls, Oregon, I came up to the radar site on the evening shift, and where there's normally 2 or 3 people in the radar room, there was quite a few, from the cooks to maintenance, all kinds of people, and I asked what was going on, and they said that they was watching a UFO, and I immediately was stunned and asked if the Pentagon was notified. Somebody called the president, and they said no, they don't do that. It was stationary, wasn't moving at all, and it would slowly lower itself down until it got behind a mountain, so that you lost radar contact. It would stay down for about 15 minutes, and the next thing you knew, it was right back up there. It was up, 80, 90,000 feet. And then the next sweep of the radar scope, it would be, like 200 miles away, stationary, completely stopped. And I said, well, we should call the news media or, call somebody. This is earth-shaking news. And to me, and he said, no, just calm down. NORAD knows about it. They called NORAD. And that's when the senior NCO pulled me to the side and said that NORAD knows about it. That's the only people we notify. We don't talk about this. We don't tell anybody about this. The people that know. And we just watch, see what happens, and that's it. And I insisted, well, there has to be a report filed or something filed, And he said, well, that there is a report that you can file. It's about 1 inch thick. And the first 2 pages is about the sighting. The rest of it is basically a psychological profile of you, your family, your bloodlines, everything. So when the Air Force goes through it, they can discredit you completely by either saying that you was on drugs, or your mother was a communist, or anything to discredit you, and you'd never get a promotion. And I'd spend the next 3.5 years up at the North Pole, living in a tent checking the weather balloons. My second encounter was while I was stationed in Sault Ste. Marie, Michigan. It was in 1972. I was working alone that night when I got a phone call from the switchboard operator. He said he had the state police on the phone and wanted to talk to me. He was real frantic when he got on the phone and said that there's 3 UFOs over the north tower of the Mackinac Bridge. So I immediately, turned on the radar. When they asked if I had it on radar, I told them no. It's more of a programmed response, thinking back to Klamath Falls, where you're told you don't talk about it, you don't write it down, you don't discuss it. And in the meantime, I called NORAD and told them, and they looked it up, and they said, oh, it's coming up, they're going up I-75. I said, yes, at about 70, 80 miles an hour. Now, about halfway between St. Nicholas and Sault Ste. Marie, there's Kinchlow Air Force Base, which is a SAC base, which they have B-52 bombers. They had 2, apparently, that were on final approach, and that crosses I-75. And so apparently they diverted those 2 bombers because they didn't want, if they have nuclear weapons or not, but they didn't want to take a chance on them meeting UFOs about the same altitude crossing the highway. So they diverted the 2 B-52s. It was a real eye-opener, how deep the secrecy goes, how deep the cover-up is.
Enrique Colbic is a senior air traffic controller at Mexico City International Airport. He testifies that up to the current day, that these objects are tracked on radar at Mexico City International, moving at extraordinary speeds, and at times as many as 12 to 15 of them have been seen on radar at the same time. They are being visually seen by pilots and, in one case, photographed by civilians. He also states that one event involved 32 air traffic controllers who saw the same event. These are trained professionals in a very busy international airport.
We have registered information about 12 or 15 echoes at the same time. A lot of pilots in reports when immediately to have an sighting, to have problems with his instruments of flight, precisely the electronic instruments. The pilots reports the size of these objects around 100 meters or greater. Our radar, and at the same time, like in other radars in the world, doesn't detect light. Only objects, solid objects flying. That is very important. We have two Mexican aircrafts flying, bound to the, coming from the north to the airport, flying to land. When one of them reports to have inside a small object of red color flying faster and passing beside him very fast, and the aircraft that was flying behind of the first reports to have another more inside, and they have visual contact with these three different objects, different color. Was red, and the other two white. Around 32 controllers have the same sighting, the same phenomenon inside. This kind of phenomenon appears sometimes 12 times a day, 12 times at the month, or at the week. This phenomenon, of course, doesn't count with a flight plan. Nobody knows nothing about them. Appears when they want to appear.
Chuck Sorrells is a career Air Force military man who was at Edwards Air Force Base in 1961 when not one, but at least 7 UFOs were over Edwards Air Force Base airspace, moving in extraordinary nonlinear fashion at enormous speeds, making right-hand turns and other maneuvers which no known aircraft could do. They were on radar, they were seen visually, and a special UFO officer scrambled and authorized a jet to intercept these objects. They were present between 1:30 a.m. and dawn, meaning that this event lasted for 5 or 6 hours.
At about 1:30 or so in the morning, I noticed this real bright light to the east of my field, and it was kind of a light green, I would describe it, and it had a red light underneath it, and the red light, it wasn't actually a flashing light, it's kind of, I'd say, pulsating type, probably be a better description of it, red underneath, and it had a white like light on top that just glowed. And I had the one of the detachment guys from the interceptor detachment that was on the base there, had the captain down there, got him awake and got him to go out and look at it. And yeah, what is that, you know? And so we talked about it for a while. And RAPCON people, that's radar people that on the base, they didn't have any aircraft in the area at the time. And so we called it down to the air defense people at Los Angeles Air Defense Sector, and the director down there decided he got to call around these sites, and at one point in time they had at least 4 different radar sites that were getting radar returns on these things, and then all of a sudden there's like 3 more objects, and they had similar characteristics as far as the lighting is concerned, but these 3 stayed like together. They stayed like I don't know if they were formation or what it was, but anyway, these 3 stayed together, and then they stayed there for a little bit, and then they moved down to the south of me and set there stationary a while. And then a little bit later on, there's 3 more appears, but these 3 are individual ones, and so at this point I had like 7 of them. This goes back and forth for I don't know, 2-3 hours. And they finally decided to scramble an aircraft on it to go up and take a look at it. And this was coordinated with the other higher headquarters, and I think NORAD was involved and everybody. Well, about 3 different times that night, he was able to, he'd say contact. And that contact means he had contact with something on his radar in the cockpit of the aircraft. But these objects played around there for the remainder of the ship, and they just disappeared into the atmosphere. I know a lot of things this was not. I know it was not a helicopter. I know it was not an airplane. I know it was not a balloon, a weather balloon or any other type of balloon. And I know it was no known aircraft flying object that we know of today, or at that time. And it wasn't a laser show, it wasn't anything like that. But they could move real fast. They could move from the east, they could be to the east of my field, and then in just a short period of time they could be to the west. They could probably go 30-40 miles in time you could snap your fingers twice. I mean, just fast.
Colonel Charles Brown is a career Air Force officer, a hero of World War II, and worked specifically in Project Grudge. This is a project which for many people didn't really exist, but it did. And his testimony not only proves its existence, but also he will state, and you will hear, how the project had definitive cases and evidence, cases that involved ground radar, air visual, and ground visual all at the same time in the same event. And as he said, it doesn't get any better than that.
Basically because of my counterintelligence training and police work in an outfit called Office of Special Investigations. Since I had one of the few pilot-trained investigators, I ended up doing a lot of investigations of unusual aircraft accidents in which sabotage was suspected, and as a consequence became acquainted with some outstanding scientists, and worked with the Air Technical Intelligence Center on a project called Grudge. At that time, Office of Special Investigations was a worldwide investigative unit in the Air Force, and were given the responsibility of investigating what became known as unidentified flying objects. And my job was to hand carry these reports over to the technical center and coordinate them with the project officer, answer any questions from an investigative viewpoint that I could assist on. Some of the objects reported were tracked on radar. We had objects with 4-way confirmation: ground visual, ground radar; airborne visual, airborne radar. And so far as I'm concerned, it don't get no better than that. I do remember speeds in excess of 4,000 to 5,000 miles an hour, which were far in excess of any known aircraft that we had or any of the enemies There's no question, I've seen radar photographs of organized flights of unidentified objects, balls of light, if you will. And these were on radar, ground, visual, ground radar, airborne visual, airborne radar. Now the airborne visual, strangely enough, by the time they get a couple of fighters down there, those things apparently disappeared whenever they wanted to.
Mr. John Callahan is a senior FAA official. He was third or fourth down from the top of the FAA underneath Admiral Ingram at the time in 1986 that a major UFO event happened over Alaska. He will state that these objects were indeed on radar, that they were tracked moving in extraordinary nonlinear fashion and at speeds unattainable by any conventional propulsion system, and that the CIA, at a meeting with the admiral who headed up the FAA and the science advisors for President Reagan, at the end of the briefing, took all the evidence and said, quote, "This meeting never happened, this event never happened, and we were never here." I wish to emphasize that John Callahan is one of those senior government officials that people are always asking about. Where are they? Why don't they come forward? Well, Mr. Callahan has come forward, and his testimony is definitive. In addition to John Callahan's testimony, we have an enormous amount of material which he had kept from his days at the FAA as a senior official there. These include the pilot's report of the encounter, the actual videotape of the radar tracings, the FAA report which was generated, and transcripts of the air traffic controller talking to the Japan Airlines 747 captain, a military pilot, as well as subsequently a United Airlines pilot.
The way it started is there was a 747, a Japanese airline, 747, was coming from the northwest going across the Alaskan territory. And he was at either 31, 33, or 35,000 feet. And it was, I want to say around 11 o'clock at night, but you can check the real times. He called and asked the controller if the controller had any traffic at his altitude. And the controller said no. Basically, it was a midnight operation. They didn't have too much traffic. And he said, well, something like, I have a target at my 11 o'clock or 1 o'clock position, about 8 miles. Now, in the 747, they have radar in the nose that picks up the weather outside there. So his radar is picking up a target. He sees this target with his eye, and the target, the way he described it, was a huge ball with lights running around it, and I think he said it was like 4 times as big as a 747. Well, when they read the reports that come through, the FAA has to protect themselves, so you can't say you saw a target, even though this is what he said. So they made him change his report to position symbols, which makes it sound like it wasn't really a target. The military controller has what they call height-finding radar, and they have long-range radar and short-range radar. So if they don't catch it on one of their systems, they catch it on the other. And if you listen to the military man, at one time he said, I have it on the height radar, or my range radar, whatever he called it, which indicated that he had a target on his system. The Japanese pilot would say he's now at 11 o'clock, he's now at 1 o'clock, he's now at 3 o'clock, he was bouncing around, this guy here, and when he would say that, the military guy would cut in and say he's now at 2 o'clock or 3 o'clock, and he would confirm the position. So it would go from 1 o'clock, 7 or 8 miles, to 6, 7 o'clock, 7 or 8 miles inside of 4 or 5 seconds. You have to be moving pretty quickly. When it was all done, and we went back to Washington the next day, the administrator had called down and wanted to know if he had a problem or not. And my boss had told him, well, we took a video of it, and it looks like there might have been something there. The administrator, which was Ingen at the time, Admiral Ingen, he said, well, have you got that video with you? Can you show me the video? And I said, yeah. And then, you just plug it in and play it. So we plugged it in for him. He started watching it, and after about 5 minutes, he told the staff, I cancel my, he had a meeting with someone in 15 minutes. He says, first he said, I'll be late, and then next it was cancel, and then I'm going to be here till this is over. So he watched the whole thing just over half an hour. A few minutes later, the Admiral calls down and says, I set up a briefing tomorrow morning at 9 or 10 o'clock, what it was. In the round room, bring all the stuff you have, bring everybody up there, and give them whatever they want, and we want to get out of it. Just let them do whatever they want to do with it. They brought in 3 people from the FBI, 3 people from the CIA, and 3 people from Reagan's scientific study team, and I don't know who the rest of the people were. But they were all excited. When they got done, they actually swore all these other guys into that this never took place. We never had this meeting, and this was never recorded. He said this is the first time they ever had 30 minutes of radar data on a UFO, and they're all itching to get their hands into the data and to find out what it is and what really goes. And if they come out and told the American public that they ran into a UFO out there, it would cause panic across the country, so therefore you can't talk about it. And they're taking all this data. So I said, okay, take all that data, if that's what you want. But they took only what we had there. They didn't ask me if there was anything else that I had. They said they're taking all this data. And I said, fine. Now, I had the original video that I took, and I had the pilot's report that came through, the first report, and I had the FAA's first report that was all downstairs on my table. They didn't ask for that, so I didn't give it to them. When they asked me what I thought, I told them that it looked like we had a UFO that was up there. The reason it wasn't on the FAA's tapes was because it was too large of an aircraft, and it was picked up as weather, so we wouldn't record it. That the pilot, the Japanese pilot, seen it. The Japanese pilot drew pictures of it. Eventually, they gave the Japanese pilot a hard time because of what he said. He was embarrassing his country. Our military controllers said they seen it. Our FAA controllers said they seen it. Our FAA controllers, after a period of time, came back and said they really didn't see a target. They saw something else, which makes it sound like somebody is helping them fill out their reports, and therefore that looks suspicious. My guess is, because of the way it was, it's not part of the military's operation anymore, that it was a UFO. But who do you tell that you were involved in a UFO incident without them looking at you like you ain't wrapped too tight?
Captain Kenju Teruchi was piloting a Boeing 747, Japan Airlines, from Paris, France to Tokyo over the polar route. And I interviewed him by phone. I'm the only civilian to interview this gentleman, after he and his crew had a major sighting over northern Alaska on their way to Anchorage to land for refueling. And as a result of his following the rules, which he did, making a report out, landing safely, delivering the cargo, being a good pilot, Japan Airlines asked him to not fly anymore. I have over 3,000 cases now. A certain proportion are certainly historical that I've not interviewed myself, because in some of them they're so old I wasn't even alive. I wasn't born yet. And many of them come from Project Blue Book, which is the official Air Force study of the subject. And I would say in half of the cases at least, the phenomenon appears to approach the airplane, not the other way around. It's as if the aircraft is the focus of attention or curiosity, if I may use that word, of the phenomenon. That the pilot's flying along, minding his own business, and something comes up alongside one wing for 15 minutes at cruise altitude, cruise speed, and then sometimes will flip over to the other wing, or stay right at the nose of the aircraft and then do barrel rolls along the flight axis. Some very interesting maneuvers. I could say that at least in the non-black programs, we could not do what these objects were reported as doing. As a result of this review of my AirCat files, I found a number of cases back in the 60s, for instance, when the Air Force was still heavily involved in this subject, where they stepped in and interviewed, let's use the word, commercial pilots, not just their own military pilots, but commercial pilots, and ended the interview by saying, "You're not to tell anybody about what you saw."
And I got off duty one night at midnight and went to bed, and I was called and told to come fix the radar. There was something wrong with it. And so when I got up to CIC and I asked them what the problem was, they said, well, we're tracking an aircraft here at 3,400 miles an hour. And I said, well, there is something wrong. So I took that radar offline, put the standby radar online, and went to work, and I started running all the tests, and everything was normal. So as a result of talking with them, I said, I can't find anything wrong with the radar. But there was clearly, they had clear plots, and they told me, this is an absolute stellar contact, because you usually get the size of the blips usually do with either the size of the contact or the shape, something, and this was a blip that was better than a ½ inch across, which indicated a really large target or something very close. So I asked the duty officer if he was going to report it, and he said no. And I said, why not? And he said, well, he says, you've just told me there's nothing wrong with the radar. You've run all the checks you can run. There's nothing wrong with the radar. We know we tracked the thing. If we report it, then Colorado Springs is going to ask us what's wrong with our equipment. And you've already said there's nothing wrong. So you and I then have a problem. We both are in trouble. We got to come up with a story. And he says, I'm not going to report it. It was one contact. That was it. So one night I was on the plot board. This was maybe 3 or 4 months later. And here comes this contact, and the second blip, you could see that this thing was moving. It was moving like 3 or 4 inches on a 360-mile scale, and so sure enough, I plotted it, and it was 3,400 miles an hour. And again, we didn't report it, but they said, there's nothing wrong. This is our friend back, and away we went. And nobody thought anything about it. It was interesting. We didn't make a big deal out of it, but we sure like to know what that was. It happened at least 3 more times that I had radar operator friends that would tell me, well, we had another one of those fast ones last night.
And I was flying a flight from San Francisco to Boston, the DC-10. And we were about halfway between Buffalo and Albany at 37,000 feet. All of a sudden, the airplane started, it was on autopilot. The airplane started at about a 15-degree bank, turned to the left. And of course, I looked out the window automatically, that's what you do when the airplane starts to turn. And I saw this brilliant light off. And it's hard to tell exactly how far out it is, but it was very, very bright. And the first officer saw it, and the second officer got out of his seat and took a look. About that time, the first officer hit the autopilot release button and went back to manual control. And as I was looking out the window, why this thing that we had vision, this thing that we saw, disappeared back towards the left of the airplane and to our rear at a very rapid rate.
This next section of the video, of this briefing tape, is regarding the Strategic Air Command and nuclear facilities. I wish to emphasize that the witnesses we have here, again, are from diverse services. They range from the Atomic Energy Commission to people who have been at Strategic Air Command facilities and at missile launch control facilities throughout the United States and Canada. These witnesses give unmistakably clear testimony about the fact that these extraterrestrial vehicles appear to be quite concerned with our weapons of mass destruction. And in fact, more than one of these witnesses has stated to me that they believe that these extraterrestrial vehicles were there because they were very concerned that we might blow ourselves up or that we might begin to go into space and be a threat, perhaps someday, to other civilizations. Professor Robert Jacobs is a respected professor at a major United States university who, back in the 1960s, was in the United States Air Force assigned to Vandenberg Air Force Base. His testimony is corroborated by letters and documents we have from his commanding officer, Florence Mansman. This man was present when a special photographic array photographed a testing of an intercontinental ballistic missile, and as it reached subspace, this missile was intercepted by one of these extraterrestrial vehicles and was rendered inert. This was on film. The film was confiscated. They were told to be quiet about it, and the specific frames dealing with the UFO encounter with this missile were cut out by intelligence officers and were never seen again. Again, this witness, who has tremendous credibility, has corroboration from a now deceased senior military officer and subsequently a professor at Stanford University, Florence Mansman.
They counted down the missile. We heard engine ignition, lift off. We knew the missile was underway. And we were looking down southwest, and the missile popped up through the fog. It was just beautiful. And I hollered, "There it is!" And our guys on our M45 tracking mount with 180-inch lenses on it got it. And the big BU telescope swung over and got it. And we followed the thing, and sure enough, we could see all three stages of powered flight as they burned out and dropped away. And then, of course, to our naked eye, all we saw was a smoke trail going off into subspace as it headed off toward its target, which was Eniwetok Island, Eniwetok Atoll. So we whooped and shouted and heard the film wrap off in the BU telescope and figured, well, that was our first big deal and we got it. We sent the film back down to Vandenberg, and I don't know exactly how long it was after the event. It might have been a day or two. I was called into Major Mansman's office at the 1st Strategic Aerospace Division headquarters. And I walked into his office, and they had a screen and a 16mm projector set up. There was a couch, and Major Mansman said, "Sit down," and there were two guys, as I recall, two guys in gray suits, civilian clothes, which was fairly unusual. And Major Mansman said, "Watch this," and turned on the film projector. And I watched the screen, and there was the launch from a day or two before at Big Sur. It was quite exciting because of the length of the telescope. As the Atlas missile entered the frame, we could see the whole third stage, which has two rocket nozzles like this and one in the center, a gimbaled one in the center, fill in our frame from about 160 miles. That was pretty exciting optics. We watched that stage burn out, we watched the second stage burn out, we watched the third stage burn out, and into the frame came something else. It flew into the frame like this, and it shot a beam of light at the warhead, which is represented by my thumb here. Now, remember, all this stuff is flying at several thousand miles an hour. So this thing fires a beam of light at the warhead, hits it, and then this thing flies up like this. Meanwhile, we're all going like this, fires another beam of light, goes around like this, we're going like this, fires another beam of light, goes down like this, fires another beam of light, and then flies out the way it came in. And the warhead tumbles out of space. The object, the points of light that we saw, the warhead and so forth, were traveling through subspace about 60 miles straight up. And they were going somewhere in the neighborhood of 11 to 14,000 miles an hour when this thing caught up to them, flew in, flew around them, went like this, and flew back out. Everything was going about between 11 and 14,000 miles an hour that way. Now when the lights came on, Major Mansman turned around and looked at me and said, "Were you guys screwing around up there?" And I said, "No, sir." And he said, "What was that?" And I said, "It looks to me like we got a UFO." Major Mansman, who was a very good reader of film, said that the feeling at the time was that it must have been extraterrestrial. That they assumed that the beam of light that struck the warhead, the dummy warhead, was some sort of plasma beam, because it looked like a plasma beam. He said what happened is this. They took the film and they spooled off the part that had the UFO on it, and they took a pair of scissors and cut it off. They put that on a separate reel, they put it in their briefcase, they handed Major Mansman back the rest of the film and said, "Here, I don't need to remind you, Major Mansman, of the severity of a security breach. We'll consider this incident closed."
Colonel Ross Diedrichson had an illustrious career with the Air Force, which was followed by many years of service with the Atomic Energy Commission. During those years with the Atomic Energy Commission, he learned of specific incidents, not just one, but many, where these UFOs were over weapon storage areas, nuclear manufacturing facilities, as well as intercontinental ballistic missile sites. He also testifies that he learned specifically that we were planning to demonstrate our power to the Soviets by placing a nuclear missile on the moon and exploding it there, and that this missile was intercepted by extraterrestrial vehicles as it left Earth's atmosphere. This man has had a tremendous career, and we have documentation of his assignment not only in the Air Force but at the Atomic Energy Commission. He is an elderly gentleman who is coming forward because he thinks this should be known by the world.
This is July of 1952. And of course, during that period of time, I made a lot of contacts. I was a staff officer for the Military Liaison Committee between the chairman of the AEC and the Secretary of Defense. And so I became acquainted with not only the Army, Navy, and Air Force, but civilian agencies, the CIA, the National Security Agency, and other contacts which I developed. During that period of time, one of my functions was to accompany a security team which visited all of the nuclear facilities to check on the security of weapons. And we were getting reports of visits by UFOs over the storage facilities and even some of the manufacturing facilities. Later, I was assigned to the Sandia Corporation as a military liaison, and I was involved in establishing a quality assurance program for the manufacture and the quality and the maintenance of the nuclear weapons. So we had to visit all of the manufacturing facilities, such as the Rocky Flats and the Pantex facility, which assembled the nuclear and non-nuclear components of the weapons. And so there again, we observed the UFOs were very much interested in the facilities that we were visiting. Almost cases where the UFOs became identified, at least on a radar or with reports, why they would try to scramble aircraft to intercept them. It was a very aggressive, you might say, response from our own government. Then I was assigned to the Unified Pacific Command under Admiral Felt during the 60s, and I was the officer in charge of the alternate command post involved in nuclear weapon operation planning. And during this period of time, I also learned of a number of incidents which happened. A couple of nuclear weapons sent into space were destroyed by the extraterrestrials. Our government sent a nuclear weapon for explosion on the moon's surface. It was tended to, as I understand it, to assess some scientific data and reaction and so forth. The idea of any explosion in space by any Earth government was not acceptable to the extraterrestrials, and that has been demonstrated over and over. And then further on, I finally retired from the Air Force and joined the Boeing Company, where I was assigned to the Minuteman program, where I was responsible for the configuration accounting of all the nuclear fleet of Minuteman 1, 2, and 3. And during that period of time, I also learned about incidents involving nuclear weapons. The one incident, for example, was they actually photographed the UFO following the missile as it climbed into space and shining a beam on it, which neutralized the missile. And this was recorded. It was all hushed up, and they split up the team that observed it, but of course eventually the news came out, and it was later published and confirmed it.
Lieutenant Colonel Arnie Arneson was present at a Strategic Air Command facility when one of these objects on radar was seen. He also learned that the intercontinental ballistic missiles were rendered inert during this and a related encounter. His testimony is corroborated by another military official, Robert Salas, who was present also at Malmstrom Air Force Base during an extraordinary event. The testimony of these two men, as well as the supporting documentation, establishes the reality of these objects and that they did have a deep concern with our nuclear facilities. In addition, they demonstrated that if necessary, they could render these intercontinental ballistic missiles inert.
I was a crypto officer for the entire Ramstein Air Base. I was a top secret control officer. And in that capacity, I happened to see a classified message go through my comm center which said that a UFO has crashed on the island of Spitsbergen, Norway, and a team of scientists are coming to investigate it. I do not recall where the message came from, where it was going to, because in that capacity, we were oftentimes told, what you see here, leave here. But I can recall seeing that. The next thing that comes to mind is one that took place in 1967. I was in charge of the Communications Center at 28th Air Division at Malmstrom Air Force Base, Montana. I was, again, the top secret control officer there. I dispatched all the nuclear launch authenticator to the SAC missile crews and whatnot, so I had a very good top secret background to go on. One night, or one day I should say, I happened to see a message that came through my communications center. There again, I cannot quote the date, where it came from, where it was going to, but I do recall reading it and saying that basically that a UFO was seen near missile silo numbers, I can't recall, but it was hovering there, and it said that the crew going on duty and the crew coming off duty all saw the UFO just hovering in midair. It was a metallic circular object, and from what I understand, the missiles were all shut down. They were in the missile silos, and they were being, I don't know what SAC does as far as activating a missile is concerned, but it's basically on a standby mode, so it can be launched. But when they say it went down, it means it went dead. And something turned those missiles off, and so they could not be put in a mode of launching.
The event, the incident, I guess I call it, is happened on the morning of March 16th, 1967. As I recall, it was early in the morning, and I received a call from my topside security guard, and he said that he and some of the guards had been observing some strange lights flying around the site. It wasn't more than, well, within a few minutes, I'd say, maybe a half hour later. He calls back, and this time he's very frightened. I can tell by the tone of his voice, he's very shook up, and said, "Sir, there's a glowing red object hovering right outside the front gate." He said, "I'm looking at it right now. It's a glowing red object. I've got all the men out here with their weapons drawn." And of course, he was all shook up while he was telling me this. He was very excited. I immediately went over to my commander, who was taking a nap. We have a little cot down there in a rest period. And I was telling him about the telephone call we just received. And as I was relating this to him, our missiles started shutting down one by one. There were approximately anywhere from 6 to 8 that went down, but they went down in rapid succession, which again is extremely rare. And in the meantime, I called upstairs to find out what the status was of this object. The guard said, well, the object has left. It just left at high speed. Echo Flight is another squadron, about, I'd say, 50, 60 miles away from our location. But they had the same sort of thing happen. They had UFOs that were hovering, not the launch control facility, but the actual launch facilities where the missiles are actually located. They had some maintenance and security people out there at the time, and they were observed. The UFOs were observed by these people out at those sites. Now, they lost all 10 of their weapons. So that morning, we lost anywhere from 16 to 18 ICBMs. At the same time, UFOs were in the area and were observed by airmen. This incident was of extreme concern to SAC headquarters because they couldn't explain it. Nobody could explain what happened. There is another incident that happened just within a week of this, week after, where there were radar reports and quite a few more witnesses.
So we all turned around, and they're sitting about, I'd say, a half a mile from the tower, and at about 3,000 feet was 3 silver UFOs, sitting in a farmhouse, 2 here, then 1 covering the center. Once they started moving, they went straight up, for a while, and then they went zap. And they was off our scope, and our scope would go out to 260 miles. And so that you calculate that, and that's pretty fast. I called headquarters, and the guy on the phone, and he says, I said, okay, we got a contact. And he says, you mean SAC is running a miss against you? I said, not SAC. Not SAC. What then? I says, Cosmos. He said, wait a minute. He said, scramble on your phone. So there's a switch you could throw that scrambles everything with mine. And I said, okay, my phone's scrambled. Yours scrambled, mine's scrambled. You taking pictures, taking radar pictures, taking real pictures. He says, okay, don't say another word. He says, I will send a courier up there. He'll get there in about 6 hours. You turn everything over to him. We are never officially ever noted for those pictures that they ever received those pictures. It was just went secret. It went black, like it never happened.
And what we saw were 3 very bright but independent lights. I mean 3 separate lights. We assumed they were independent. And they were in a perfect, I guess, is equilateral, a perfect triangle. The curious thing about this formation of lights that caused us to watch it for an extended period of time, 10 or 15 minutes we watched it, was that first it was silent. Second, it was moving slowly, but in a perfectly constant altitude, perfectly constant velocity, and perfectly constant direction from north to south. When I arrived at the command post the next morning at about 6:30 in the morning, it was unusually active and unusually well-staffed. In fact, it was a beehive of activity, and there were people who had obviously been there most of the night. And it seems that these lights did position themselves over the alert force of B-52s, over the alert pad, where there were a specified number of B-52s configured for their wartime mission. And these lights were very interested in that wartime configuration, it would appear. And as sorties returned, I was told by those who had been there overnight, they were asked to close with and try to identify these lights. And this included B-52s, KC-135s, and even some of the F-106 interceptors that had been out doing their particular training missions as well. And the pattern was the same. Each time an aircraft would approach, the lights would depart in ways that defied any aerodynamic knowledge that anybody there had. Just rapid accelerations, rapid changes in direction, including vertical, and just doing things that something that is flying by the rules of aerodynamics that we understand would not have been at all possible. This whole event took from beginning to end probably in the range of 6 and perhaps more hours. And in retrospect, it is curious how quickly that subject just was dropped. It just wasn't discussed.
When I was a commander of a radar squadron up in Maine at Caswell Air Force Station, Maine, we were right next door to Loring Air Force Base, was where they launched the B-52s and the KC tankers and things like that. I had a lot of security friends over there at Loring who told me about, and I have no first-hand knowledge of it, but they also had seen UFOs hovering near the nuclear weapons storage area on Loring Air Force Base. And a lot of my technicians that worked for me as a communication electronics officer, they would tell stories about things going across the radar screens at fantastic speeds. You know, they were not, nothing could go that fast.
I was on midwatch during my second med cruise, and it was about sometime between midnight and 2 o'clock. And I had a contact come on the radar scope. I knew the difference between surface search radar and air search radar. There's differences in polarity of the radio signal and things like this, and how the waves come back, all this stealth kind of stuff, you know, active and passive electronic countermeasures. So I know the difference between a flock of geese, or, you know, wave returns, or false echoes. In fact, this was the first thing that challenged me to check it out in ECM as to whether or not the contact I had on the scope was genuine. Because this was between 65,000 feet and above, and the strength of the signal was as strong as the surface contact on the water of an aircraft carrier. This contact was huge. It was got my attention, and the attention of others that were on watch. There were 4 enlisted on watch and 2 officers at the time. And so anyway, in this particular case, it was showing up on height-finding equipment, and it was showing up on radar equipment. And then it began to move fairly slowly at first, and then very quickly. The CO came in, and he wanted to know what the heck was going on here, and they looked at it and asked what the hell was that, you know, and it got the attention of the captain at that time. Was Captain Clark, was my captain. My commander was Commander Gibson at the time. And there was only one person on watch in ECM, and before I knew, in a matter of 15 minutes, the ship was being turned, and 2 Phantom IIs were being prepared for launch. The Phantom IIs went to afterburners, and they were about 100 miles or so away from this contact and turned on the conical scan radar to lock on, and it winked out. Just disappeared. After they land on the pipe 35 minutes later, and everybody's settled down, this thing winks back on again, and it's about 12 to 15 miles from the ship, hovering at about 30,000 feet. And in any event, they went out, and the lookouts couldn't see anything. Nobody could see anything. But it was there on our radar scope. It was not a false signal. And my SEAL told me, Jordan, this, what have you got in your log? This never happened. And I wasn't the only one there on watch that night. So anybody who was there at that time knows what I'm talking about and knows that it's the truth. But less than a dozen people knew what went on that night, and that ship had 5,000 men on it. There were documents that I have seen that refer to the Roosevelt having several instances of UFO flyovers, and particularly after they took on board nuclear weapons. And I was on board when they did take those on for the first time.
This particular night, I took a message off the teletype and filed it because it was not to us, and I turned around to check the teletypes again and saw something I had never seen before, and that was that all 8 teletypes were just typing complete garbage, totally incoherent. So I immediately called the facilities control on the intercom to inform them that my broadcasts were out, and they informed me that they were busy because all communications had just gone out, ship-wide. The propulsion system still worked. We could maintain the speed and course, and we could steer, but from all the stories that I heard, anything that was electronic in nature ceased to operate. A few seconds later, we heard we had an intercom and a pneumatic tube system that went between the communications room to the signal bridge, which was located on the very top of the island structure of the carrier. And we heard a voice come on, very excited, yelling that God was here. It was the end of the world. And we looked at each other and thought, well, that's strange. What's going on there? Another few seconds went by, and another voice came on, more controlled. This person said that there's something over the ship, is what he said. There's something over the ship. Well, I looked at a friend of mine, a shipmate, and he looked at me, and we decided to go have a look. We observed a large glowing sphere over the island structure of the ship, over the ship. It was hard to decide what size this thing was because there was no perspective. It was late in the evening. The sun had gone down. It was twilight, but it looked huge. I would say anywhere from 300 or 400 feet to a quarter of a mile, depending on how high it was. It glowed in a pulsating manner between a yellowish and an orangish color. I couldn't see any details other than a glowing spherical object. Unfortunately, I only got to observe this object for less than 30 seconds because by the time we got out there and started looking at it, general quarters went off on the ship, battle stations, and we had to go back to our watch station, which was our battle stations. A few days later, the commanding officer and the executive officer came on the closed-circuit television system that we had on board. It was the only way they could address the crew of 5,000. He looked at the camera, and I'll never forget this. He looked at the camera and he said, "I would like to remind the crew that certain events that take place on board a major naval combatant vessel are considered classified and should not be discussed with anyone without any to know." Some men arrived on the ship when we returned to Norfolk to interview some people in suits. Lord knows where they came from, what agency they were from. I'm convinced that there's something to it. I'm convinced that the government, somebody in the government knows a lot more than we know.
Merle Shane McDowell worked for the United States Navy in 1981 and had a top secret SCI, Special Compartmented Intelligence clearance with zebra stripes. What this means is that he was one of a few people cleared to be in the command center at the Atlantic Command Facility near Norfolk, Virginia. During very critical events, including thermonuclear war. Merle Shane McDowell's testimony establishes that an object came in off the northern North American coast, was tracked on 4 or 5 radar stations, that jets were scrambled from multiple facilities to intercept and to attempt to force down this object which came from space. He will also testify that this object moved in one radar sweep from off the northern coast of North America to off the coast of Norfolk, Virginia, and then down to off the coast of Jacksonville, Florida. Admiral Harry Train, who was Commander-in-Chief, Atlantic Command, was present during this event, witnessed it, and was involved in scrambling jets to intercept and to attempt to force down this object.
I was granted, after a 6-month wait, a top secret special compartmented intelligence clearance with a zebra stripe identification badge, which permitted access to all facilities on the base at all times. It's the highest level of alert that the Navy has or had at that time for dealing with generally dealing with global nuclear threats. When you set a condition zebra, whether it's a drill or not, people who are not authorized to be there who do not have a zebra access badge, it's a zebra stripe badge on your clearance badge, they have to leave the command facility, and we have Marines stationed outside the building there, in the building and as well as outside, that were under orders to shoot any unauthorized personnel that remained in the command center. They would announce it beforehand, this is a drill, set condition zebra. And unauthorized personnel would be escorted out of the command center if they didn't already know that they had to leave. But they turned the lights down this time and they didn't say this is a drill. There's a door right here, and this guy, the Marine, comes in and wants to know what's going on. Is this a drill or so forth? They've got orders to start shooting people. And I know because I actually got the junior OOD's attention and said, hey, you guys need to tell this guy something. He's ready to start shooting people, because they haven't told him to stand down yet, and which he did. And I remember, wanting to just get the hell out of there. We had contact with an unidentified flying object that had entered our airspace. And at that point, when Admiral Train found out that it wasn't the Soviets, and that he wanted to know were the Soviets responding to this threat also, that was the moment that he gave authorization to put 2 planes up to go see what this thing was. Pilots, you could hear the pilots' live voice transmissions being piped into the command center, visual confirmation on the object, description of the objects. Pilots were able to close a couple of times and be able to see that the object was not an aircraft that we were familiar with, was nothing that we had, was nothing the Soviets had, and that was determined very quickly. This thing absolutely had complete control of the situation and could just be wherever it wanted to be just in a matter of seconds. One minute we're closing on it off the coast of Maine, the next minute it's in Norfolk, headed south towards Florida. As Admiral Train was doing, he was scrambling, authorizing planes up just left and right, up and down the whole eastern seaboard. It headed out over the Atlantic, towards the Azores. I do remember them saying that it had pulled up at a 66-degree angle as it approached the Azores, like this, and it just pulled up at a 66-degree angle without slowing down or anything, and left the atmosphere, just was gone. It just took off into space and was gone, and just like that. The only descriptions that I recall that the pilots actually made were that they could not find any markings on the aircraft. They could not find any visible signs that the thing had wings, a tail, windows, a cockpit, or anything like that, or any markings from any country. they did get close enough to get some photographs taken that were later brought over to the command center. Well, from the photograph, I could remember the shape. What I would have said would have been, I would say a cylinder. I would say a cylinder because it was abrupt. It had abrupt ends. The ends didn't taper down like most aircraft.
When over one of the B-52s, which were armed with nuclear weapons, there appeared a bluish haze, almost in the form of a boomerang or a wing shape. And in this haze, there was a glittery light. We had no idea what this was. And we do know that the SAC teams were called to ready, so they came out to the plane. But prior to that, this just hovered over the plane for a short period of time and then just vanished. It wasn't as if you actually saw it glide away. It was like in a wisp, it was gone. This was something that actually showed up on radar, and the perimeter guard saw it, and the other people on the other post, because there's one person per B-52 bomber.
Astronaut Gordon Cooper is one of the heroes of our country. He witnessed not only a daytime UFO event in Germany, but in addition, while working and connected to the U-2 project at Edwards Air Force Base, his team had one of these objects land in broad daylight at Edwards Air Force Base. It was filmed. He oversaw this film being developed and sent to the Pentagon under special circumstances. Again, this is a hero of our country, astronaut Gordon Cooper, stating that one of these objects, a UFO, landed in the 50s at Edwards Air Force Base, and it was filmed. He saw the film, and it was sent back to the Pentagon. And his testimony cannot be contradicted because of the credibility that this great man has.
We were flying in Germany, and we were flying F-86s. And they would come over and do the same maneuvers that we make, except every once in a while one of them would go zip. And you just can't do that in a fighter, a conventional fighter. I was having some cameramen film the installation of a precision landing facility we were putting in right on the edge of the dry lake. And this saucer flew right over them and put down 3 little gear and landed out on the dry lake bed. And they went out to, picked up their cameras and moved on out toward him filming. And he lifted off, put the gear back in the well, and climbed out at a very high rate of speed and disappeared. And so while I was going through all the regulation books and finding out the number to call in Washington to report it, I had them go over and develop the film. By the time they got back with the developed film, I was on the higher and higher and higher level officer talking to me. Finally with the colonel telling me to, when the film arrived at my desk, to put it in the carrier pouch. There would be a courier there at my office by that time already, and they'd arranged for him to fly in our base airplane back to Washington with these films. I had a chance to hold it up to the window and look at it. It was certainly a good film. I think they're for real. I think eventually we'll find out that there's regular travel here on this Earth from other planets.
Carl Wolf worked for the military and was at Langley Air Force Base as an Air Force technician during the 1960s. While there, and in his capacity working on some devices in a very secret area of Langley, he was shown by another technician photographs taken by the lunar orbiter prior to the lunar landing of structures on the moon that were specific, artificial, and constructed of stone and other materials. Some of them were very large, and he states are unmistakable evidence that someone had been on the moon before we landed in 1969, and that there are artificial structures on the moon.
My boss came to me. I was working in a color lab at that time. I was a technician, photographic technician. I was asked to go over to this facility on Langley Air Force Base where the NSA was bringing in the information from the lunar orbiter. And so I packed up some tools. I went over. I went into the facility. A couple of officers took me into this hangar. It was a very large hangar. So they took me into this laboratory. I took a look at the equipment. There was an airman second class in there. I was an airman second class as well. He turned the equipment on and put it through its paces. It didn't do what it was supposed to do. I saw what was going on with it. And I said to him, you know, we'll have to take this thing out of the lab if we're going to work on it. We can't work on it in here in the darkroom environment. So everyone left the facility, left the darkroom, except this airman second class and myself. And we're in waiting for someone to come to remove this piece of equipment. And at the time, I didn't know what the real purpose of this darkroom and this operation in this facility was. I thought this was where they were bringing the data in and then releasing the images to the public. They were doing 35 millimeter strips of film at that time, which were then assembled into 18.5 by 11 inch mosaics, they were called. There was a digital signature and a grayscale on every 35 millimeter strip. And those strips were from successive passes around the moon. So he was showing me how all this worked, and we walked over to one side of the lab, and he said, by the way, we've discovered a base on the back side of the moon. And I said, whose? What do you mean, whose? He said, yes, we've discovered a base on the back side of the moon. And at that point, I became frightened, and I was a little terrified, thinking to myself that if anybody walks in the room now, I know we're in jeopardy, we're in trouble, because he shouldn't be giving me this information. And then he pulled out one of these mosaics and showed this base, which had geometric shapes. There were towers, there were spherical buildings, there were very tall towers, and things that looked somewhat like radar dishes, but they were large structures. If I compare it to what I'm seeing now, because I do have photographs that have artifacts in them that are similar to what I saw, they're massive. Some of the structures are, you know, half a mile in size. So they're huge structures. Some of the buildings seem to have very reflective surfaces on them. A couple of structures that I saw reminded me of cooling towers at power generating plants. They had that sort of a shape. Some of them were just very, very straight and tall with a flat top. Some of them were round. Some of them looked like a Quonset hut, you know, with a domed kind of, like a greenhouse. The particular shot that I saw, there were several clustered together over a landscape, a fairly large landscape. I didn't want to look at it any longer than that because I felt that my life was in jeopardy. Do you understand what I'm saying? I would love to have looked at it longer. I would have loved to have had copies. I would love to have, you know, said more about it or discussed it more, but I knew I couldn't, and I knew that young fellow who was sharing this was really, really overstepping his bounds at that point.
They said, we were going to show you a film that might help you best put into perspective what you gentlemen have witnessed and help you maybe put it to bed a little bit for yourselves. This thing went all the way up to the space program. It showed, and I swear to God, it showed structures on the moon, these box kind of things that looked sand-colored. It showed that lunar car moving around. I remember those clearly because I remember being a child when all that was happening, but them at a distance pointing, astronauts pointing at these box-looking things, structured objects moving off the surface of the moon, filmed by definite Apollo missions.
Donna Hare is a former NASA employee at Johnson Space Center, a technician, who was present at a facility where she inadvertently was shown an aerial photograph of a UFO casting a shadow upon the ground. She confirms that the man who showed her this photograph told her that it was to be airbrushed out before released from this secret facility at NASA. She also later found that there were a number of such photographs and other evidence which NASA had, and which were routinely sanitized or eliminated before being shown outside of these compartmented operations.
This day, that particular day, I walked into the photo lab in the restricted area, and this was between missions. One of the gentlemen I had been friends with, and I still talk to occasionally, he pointed my attention to one area of this mosaic. It was one panel of a mosaic, and I said, "This is really interesting." He explained everything, and then he, with a smile on his face, he said, "Look over there." And I looked, and in one of the photo panels, I saw a round white dot. And at the time, it was very crisp, very sharp lines on it. And I said to him, what is that? Is that a dot on the emulsion? And then he's grinning, and he says, dots on the emulsion don't leave round shadows on the ground. And there was a round shadow at the right angle, at the correct angle, the sun shining on the trees. I saw pine trees. I didn't see a coastline. I don't know where this was. But I looked at him, and I was pretty startled because I'd worked out there several years and never seen anything like this, never heard of anything like this. And I said, "Is this a UFO?" And he's smiling at me, and he says, "I can't tell you that. I can't tell you that." What I knew he meant was, it was, but he couldn't tell me. So I said, "What are you going to do with this information?" And he said, "Well, we always have to airbrush them out before we sell them to the public." And I was just amazed that they had a protocol in place for getting rid of UFO pictures. I asked guards, security guards. I ran into another security guard that was forced to burn a lot of UFO pictures. And he told me, he came into my office one day. This was when I worked at another job. He came into my office, and he was very frightened. And he said, "Donna, I heard you were interested in this subject." He said, "I used to work out there. And one day, some soldiers came in the fatigues and had me burn pictures." And he said that he was burning them, and he was forced not to look at them. But he was tempted. He looked at one of them, and it was a UFO on the ground. Shortly thereafter, he was hit in the head with a gun butt, and he still had a scar on his forehead from that, being knocked out, because he looked at the picture.
And we get quite a bit of information about the sightings. We get drawings of what the vehicles look like, whether they landed or not, whether they saw any people with them, extraterrestrials, things like that. And we would get pictures in of the supposedly AVM or satellite areas that picked up on the Soviets, what they were building sites. And once in a while, an anomaly would show up on the picture that didn't belong there. A round object, a triangular object. They were not markings put on the photograph that indicate some place or anything like that. These were above ground. They were not part of the picture itself.
Yes, there have been ET visitation. There have been crashed craft. There have been material and bodies recovered. And there is some group of people somewhere that may or may not be associated with government at this point, but certainly were at one time, that have this knowledge and have been attempting to conceal this knowledge or not permit it to be widely disseminated. The question of has it been kept secret or how could it be kept secret? It hasn't been kept secret. It's been there all along, but it has been the subject of disinformation in order to deflect attention and to create confusion so that the truth doesn't come out. Disinformation is simply another method of stonewalling, and that's been used consistently for the last 50 years or so.
Nick Pope is a Ministry of Defense official, still currently employed at the Ministry of Defense, who headed up the Ministry of Defense's UFO office for investigating this phenomenon for a number of years in the 1990s. I met Mr. Pope when he was still working in that capacity back in 1993. In his testimony, you will learn of incontrovertible evidence of events of massive objects moving at extraordinary speeds on radar, which are not manufactured on this earth. He will also confirm the Bentwaters case and other extraordinary cases within the United Kingdom and the existence of extensive government files related thereto.
I received somewhere between 200 and 300 UFO reports each year, and my job was to evaluate these to come to a decision about whether there was evidence of any threat to the defence of the United Kingdom. We were left with a hard core of sightings which defied any conventional explanation whatsoever, and these were a bunch of interesting cases involving sightings by military personnel, near misses between UFOs and aircraft, instances where UFOs were tracked on radar, and cases where UFOs were captured on film and video. One of the most significant waves of sighting in Europe took place over Belgium in March of 1990, and on that occasion UFOs were seen by large numbers of people on the ground and tracked on radar, resulting in 2 F-16 fighter interceptors being scrambled. These aircraft then picked up the UFO themselves on their airborne radar, and an intriguing game of cat and mouse played itself out in the skies of Belgium over the next hour or so. On the 30th and 31st of March 1993, a series of UFO encounters took place over Great Britain, the most interesting of which involved an occasion where 2 Air Force bases were actually overflown by a large triangular or diamond-shaped UFO. Now, the 2 establishments involved in this are RAF Cosford and RAF Shawbury. One important fact about the British wave of sightings in March 1993 was that it happened 3 years to the very night after the wave of sightings that rocked the establishment in Belgium and led to the scrambling of F-16s. That, again, was late on the 30th and in the early hours of the 31st of March. I've made no secret of the fact that I believe some of these UFOs may well be of extraterrestrial origin. Now, I know that that's an extraordinary statement for a serving officer in the Ministry of Defence to make, but it is me speaking on the basis of 3 years official research and investigation. So I don't make these statements lightly, and I don't do so on the basis of a blind leap of faith. I do it on the basis of the data held by the government.
Now, during this next section of the videotape, you will hear from people who have been involved in events where objects of extraterrestrial origin have landed or have crashed or been forced down and which have been retrieved. This is, of course, explosive testimony. It establishes the reality of the phenomenon and also of the fact that we have been studying this phenomenon for years. Many people will think that this is limited to the so-called Roswell event of the 1940s. This could not be further from the truth. In fact, there have been multiple events, at least a couple of dozen, events, where objects of extraterrestrial origin have been acquired, have been retrieved, and which have been studied. We think that this is something which is of extreme importance because you cannot consider that covert programs, having spent hundreds of billions of dollars over the decades on research and development, so-called reverse engineering or back engineering of extraterrestrial technologies, have not had significant breakthroughs. The testimony will show that in fact we have had breakthroughs which have trickled out to our society in the form of certain advances in electronics. However, the central breakthrough dealing with the physics of the quantum vacuum space, the so-called zero-point energy phenomenon, as well as the anti-gravity electrogravitic phenomenon, that these technologies have been withheld from our society. Brigadier General Stephen Lubkin is a practicing attorney in North Carolina and a brigadier general in the Army National Guard with the JAG Division. He, as a young man, was assigned to the White House during Eisenhower's period, and also at the Pentagon saw some of the material from the crash of an extraterrestrial vehicle in New Mexico. He also speaks about Eisenhower's knowledge of the subject and his great concern about the fact that there were projects and activities about which he apparently was not being informed.
We were in the basement of the Pentagon, and in those days, that was in 1959, there was a tremendous amount of security there in the basement of the Pentagon. Anybody who's worked there knows what I'm talking about. I learned a lot about Project Blue Book. Blue Book was discussed quite openly in the office. Sections of Blue Book were open for discussion, and then there were other matters as well that were brought to our attention one afternoon when we were just about ready to finish up training. It was about 3:30, maybe 3:45 in the afternoon. Colonel Hollibird brought out a piece of what appeared to be metallic. It was a metallic piece of looked like a yardstick. It had deciphering. It had encryption on it. He describe them as being symbols of instruction, and that's as far as he would go. But he did infer that the instructions, whatever they might have been, were something that was important enough for the military to keep working on a constant basis. It seemed giant-like when I saw it because it was the first time I'd ever seen anything like this before, and all eyes were just peeled on that particular thing. And when he told us what it was, it was frightening. It was eerie. There, you could have heard a pin drop in the room when it was first mentioned. Well, he said it had been taken from one of the craft that had crashed in New Mexico, and that it had been taken from a box of materials that the military was working on. They didn't use the word reverse engineering at that time, but it was something similar to the reverse engineering that they felt like they needed to work on, and it was going to take years to do this. Extraterrestrial bodies, yes. There were either 3 or 5, and they didn't even know at that point, because some of the information that they had gotten apparently was incomplete. But 3 or 5 stands out in my mind as the number that were taken. One was alive, partially alive at the time that this happened, and I do not know what may have happened to him after that. The findings that were put in there were highly scientific, and they were highly gone over by the people that knew what they wanted to put in there. This information was information that would never get out to to anyone else, but it was designed for the use of particular military personnel. There were probably 1,500 reported cases at that time. I would say there probably were between 200 and 300 cases of lock-on. And that's why those cases were in there, because they were authentic. You saw an awful lot. You saw a lot of pictures. Most of the pictures we have seen duplicates of today. Some were, the pictures that I saw were, I think, maybe a little bit better. They were taken by Air Force pilots, as well
pictures
of the UFOs. Yes.
So they actually had pictures of UFOs in these.
Oh, indeed they did. Yes, not only the Air Force, but some were taken by civilian pilots. Some were taken by Marine Air Corps pilots, and some were foreign. The whole process of dealing with the UFO phenomenon could not be handled anymore by one agency, and so in order to keep it alive, and I guess as cheaply as possible, it was given to various and sundry parts of the government to work on, and I guess they thought that they could also keep the intelligence factor as secret as possible by giving little agencies a little bit here and a little bit there, and that oftentimes is done with matters like this. But what happened was Eisenhower got sold out. I think that he realized that all of a sudden this matter is going into the control of corporations. He realized that he was losing control. He realized that the phenomenon of whatever it was that we were faced with was not going to be in the best hands, and those were as far as I can remember, that was the expression that was used. It's not going to be in the best hands.
Harlan Bentley was with the United States Army in Maryland when one of these objects came in and crashed very near the facility where he was working one evening in the 1950s. In addition, on subsequent nights, these objects were tracked on radar and were tracked moving in extraordinary ways. Later, while working in a sensitive intelligence capacity, he was at a facility in California, which he prefers not to name, monitoring the transmissions from one of our Apollo moon missions. And in this transmission, he heard and has testified that the astronauts encountered some sort of UFO or object in space en route to the moon.
In 1957 to 59, I was mostly outside of Albany, Maryland, just north of Washington, D.C., at a Nike Ajax missile facility. I was a radar operator. In May of 1958, about 6 a.m., and the reason I knew it was 6 is because that's when everybody got up. I looked out the window. At first I heard a sound. It sounded like a pulsating transformer. I looked out the window and looked across the field and saw this object heading towards the ground and saw it crash. It broke apart, and then it took off again in flight. It was probably in excess of 30 feet in diameter. It had circular balls appeared on the outer rim up close to a cake-like fixture on top. And they were different colors. They were orange and red and some yellow, but they were pulsating. So, I mean, it was quite a sight to see as it was wobbling towards the earth and hit. And it came in at a fairly rapid rate. The other issue there was that when the craft took off again after it crashed, it went through a grove of trees, which it actually sheared 3, 4, 5-inch limbs in just one fell swoop, like a knife or a machete. The largest piece that I saw, which was actually glowing white hot, was probably the size of a washing machine. Shortly thereafter, the Air Force personnel had arrived going across this field and started picking up these pieces. Now, they used long poles, very long poles, to pick up the biggest piece, and they proceeded to put it on a truck that was lead-lined truck and pushed it in with another long pole and got it inside the truck itself. Then the other personnel picked up the other pieces that were laying about. The real exciting part happened the next evening while I was on duty, and it was approximately 10, 11 at night. And I got a call from the Gaithersburg facility saying that they had 12 to 15 UFOs 50 to 100 feet off the ground. So I asked the guy who was on the radio with me, I said, what do they sound like? He took his head mic off, put it out the van window, and again the pulsating sound, except there were more of them. I had the radar on, the M33 radar, sweep radar, and I found right next to the ground clutter where Gaithersburg sits, I found the blip where these vehicles were. And then all of a sudden they all took off at the same time. And from my radar scope it went one sweep. It's a 33 1/3 RPM. To go that distance from the center out to where I got the next blip in the first sweep at a constant velocity would have to be 17,000 miles an hour, which we calculated from our analog computer. I was at a facility in California, that's all I can say, and I was doing particular classified work. Set aside from what was actually happening there. It was a completely different scenario. The only thing I can say is it was occurring at the same time that our astronauts were doing a loop around the moon and back again. On their trip to that moon, or to the moon itself, I heard the expression of the bogey coming in at 11 o'clock. Well, familiar with that particular term, I perked my ears and started listening a little bit and discovered that Houston and the astronauts were talking back and forth about a collision. And the astronauts asked for permission to do avoidance for a collision, and Houston finally granted that permission to do that. And after the comm links settled down a little bit, the astronauts said it's not necessary. They are now paralleling our course, and there was a discussion as to what was paralleling that course. There was another type of ship. There were portals there that they could see in. They could see beings of some sort. They did not describe these beings. They just took photographs. And after a while, a few thousand miles, and then they took off from the capsule that they were flying in and went away.